Part 2, The First Draft. Chapter 8, The Frightening Blank Page. First scene, a reiteration of the last chapter. A hint for the first scene, start with a small conflict. While authors in the past have been able to write classics without this, modern readers are more inclined to want to be drawn in instantly. That means no info dumping of the family history before you introduce the main character, no lengthy backstory of the world and its political structure. Instead, introduce your character right away, with the briefest of descriptions, and drop them into a conflict. It can be small, like an argument, or frustration with a computer program, or a dropped coffee mug. Anything to bring the reader into direct sympathy with the character and show their mettle. Typically, this allows the reader to identify with the character. While some authors have famously started books with someone other than the main character, I'm looking at you, George R.R. Martin, this is difficult and requires high skill. He also received a lot of slack for it. If you are going to pull a GRRM and kill off your main character in your story, you had better do it well. This is a classic case of first learn the rules and why they are important, then learn how to break them properly. Pablo Picasso was an amazing realistic artist before he dove into his other forms. Same with Salvador Dali. Another note about the first scene. It doesn't have to be perfect. On a first draft, it doesn't even have to be good. If you are like most authors, you'll likely rewrite, change, shift around, or completely scrap the first scene in subsequent drafts. Every first draft is perfect, because all a first draft has to do is exist. Jane Smiley. If you insist on getting it perfect the first time, you'll never finish the rest of the draft. That is true of both the writing phase and the planning phase. Another typical thing I've seen, especially with first-time novelists, is that their book is often made stronger by chopping off the first chapter. Or more. My first published novel, Legacy of Hunger, I chopped off the first 4 chapters. And I likely could have gotten away with more and still not damaged the narrative. Most of that was backstory I included in snippets throughout the rest of the book. Next scenes. The goal of the first chapter, and indeed each subsequent chapter, is to entice the reader to get to the next chapter. In addition, each chapter should provide information on the narrative, character, or setting. Ideally, some of each. It should either move the plot forward or provide vital data. As I write each scene, from my scene list, I know where I came from, the previous scene, and I know where I need to end up, the next scene, so all I'm really concentrating on is how to bridge that tiny distance between. This is the secret to why extreme planning can make your writing time more efficient. You aren't worrying about how the novel is going to end. You already know that. You aren't worrying about backing your character into a corner you don't know how to rescue them from. You are only worrying about how to get them through this one scene. The amount of uncertainty has been removed from your already overburdened mental shoulders. In between writing sessions, I think about my next scene either consciously or unconsciously. It percolates and simmers and bubbles up with ideas and images. Because I know what my next scene is, thanks to my handy-dandy scene list, I know what comes next in the story. I imagine the scene in my head, blocked out like a play or a movie scene. This is pre-writing, coming up with the details before I have my hands on the keyboard. That way, when I do get the time to write, the words fly from my fingertips as fast as I can type them, and I don't waste precious writing time struggling to create the scene details. Eat that huge elephant one little bite at a time. Now, things happen as you write. One scene may not be big enough to encompass all that's happening, despite the one-sentence description. You may realize that you must expand that into 2, 5, or even 8 scenes. It happened to me, especially around the climax scenes. You may also decide that those 3 scenes are better combined into one and still cover all the cogent points. A wild side character can, and often does, pop out of nowhere and take over the narrative for a while. This happens to me often, and some of my favorite characters show up like this. Adna is one such character in my Druid's Brooch series. I didn't plan on a dotty old fae to be the main character's helper and friend. It just happened. They showed up, elbowed their way into the storyline, and stayed for the next 6 books. For those pantsers afraid of planning stifling your creativity, rest assured that there are still plenty of ways for that to shine through as you write your scenes. During this process, you will want to shift your scenes around to fit the new information you find while writing. That's fine. That's why I have it in a spreadsheet. I don't update the synopsis until the end, though, when everything is clearer. I highlight each scene in my spreadsheet as I finish writing it. I love keeping visual track of my progress. Because I'm an extreme planner. I calculate my percentage of completion, as well. I take my number of scenes planned, 80, and divide it by the number of scenes written so far, say, 20. That means I'm 25% through writing the novel. Then I divide my total word count by that percentage, and it gives me an estimate of how many words my novel should end up being. This is a very rough calculation, and it changes as I write either longer or shorter than normal scenes. It changes if I add or subtract scenes as I'm writing. But it keeps me on target to where I want the novel to be. Usually, I say that a story is as long as it needs to be. If your tale is told in 40,000 words, you have a novella. If it's 80,000, you have a novel. However, when you're writing in a series, it's a good idea to keep your word counts roughly even for consistency, so I set targets. Not that I was great at staying in those targets. My Druid's Brooch series had some books at 80,000 words and some at 120,000 words. But the stories all worked well enough. This is where I'd normally have an exercise for you to work out. However, you've already done the scary part of writing. You have the first chapter written, rewritten, and a plan with structure for the rest of your novel. Write to your heart's content.